and welcome to Polylogue, a weekly dialogue on the substance and style of the Sunday morning political shows, where we take a critical look at the policymaker, the politician, and the journalist, because each is critical and each demands criticism. I'm Naomi Soto-Steidl, your co-host and health policy professional based in California.
And I'm Brendan Steidl-Soto, your other co-host and communications specialist in government, technology, and healthcare. Our goal for Polylogue is to look at all sides of the Sunday morning talk shows.
We discuss guest performances, the style and quality of questions by the host, and the overall usefulness of roundtable discussions.
Polylogue is our attempt to find, praise, and demand constructive political dialogue.
Today is Sunday, May 12th, and on today's agenda, we're talking about kind of two overarching themes. We're going to explore the vast foreign diplomacy initiatives going on around the globe, most particularly China. And then we're also going to look at an interview with Kamala Harris and looking at the 2020 primary debate.
Yeah, that's an interview that absolutely dominated the majority of State of the Union this week. There was not a Meet the Press episode. It was preempted by sports, as it often, or sometimes is. More than other shows, it's preempted. But to start us off this week, highlight Lowlight, starting low, going high. Naomi, what is your lowlight?
Okay, so my lowlight is a moment on the Fox News Sunday panel. Now, overall, I would say the panel was actually very enlightening and just informative as panels go. Usually panels are more just hot takes, and I think the Fox News Sunday panel didn't do that today. But there was one moment that really seemed bizarre to me, and it was kind of the critique of how China reads into Trump's tweets. Let's take a listen, and then I'll explain why I think that doesn't make sense.
And you'll hear in this clip Chris Wallace as well as Jonathan Swan. He is a reporter for Axios.
You know, it is so interesting, this possibility of miscalculation. Yes. I mean, one of the things that we hear, I don't know how true it is, but there's a lot of reporting that when the Chinese saw the president constantly hectoring the Fed Reserve Chairman, Powell, to lower interest rates, that the Chinese viewed that as an indication of weakness on the part of the president, that he was worried about the strength of the U.S. economy and therefore that they had a stronger negotiating position.
Yes, and they also, every tweet he does, you know, they sort of blur through our news cycle. We don't pay in America that much attention. They're reading every tweet for this Gnostic wisdom, and it's just, I think actually they're reading too much into a lot of his comments.
I think. Okay, so this seemed completely inappropriate to me. The president's words have consequences, and leaders around the globe are scrutinizing literally over every word he says. That's why most presidents lean on prepared statements. You know, they have their team prepare for calls and meetings of all sorts. And this president is much more brash and kind of likes that kind of one-on-one impromptu style. And that leads to policy by tweets. And China is looking at it. What seemed very strange to me is that Jonathan Swan here is criticizing China for having it totally wrong and kind of reading too much into it, as opposed to expecting our president to know the consequences of his words. That seems way more appropriate to me.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think maybe he's seeing it as from the reporter's perspective of, you know, kind of the beginning of the Trump presidency, reporting on every tweet and then finding that, oh, well, it was slow walked back, or, you know, the actual administration didn't choose to move forwards with such and such policy. You know, we've documented a lot of that here on Polylogue, things that didn't end up happening. For example, when he said he was going to close the Mexican border, right? That seemed very imminent a month or two ago, and it's not even a point of conversation anymore. So I think he's maybe approaching it that way. But like you said, Naomi, there are consequences to putting out these official statements like that.
Yeah, so a real missed opportunity in the panel on Fox News Sunday. But overall, like I said, and we'll describe a little bit more later in the show about good things that were said on the panel. Do you have a lowlight, Brendan?
Yes, my lowlight was on This Week, and it was from Senator Rand Paul from the state of Kentucky. Rand Paul is often seen as a libertarian voice on the Republican right, and somebody who is very skeptical of government power in people's lives in many different ways and places. And yet, on this episode, when he's talking about Trump, he always seems to fall in line with the Republican talking points, even when it comes to President Trump potentially abusing his power, as documented by Robert Mueller in obstruction of justice during the Russia investigation. Take a listen to how he confronts these questions on This Week.
One of the things that Adam Schiff and the other partisans don't understand is that if you're accused of a crime by a grand jury and they don't indict you, the prosecutor doesn't go all over town saying, we thought he did this, we thought he did this, this is all the evidence. That's why a grand jury is secret. See, the Mueller investigation said that the president did not commit any underlying crime. And so now they're all saying he obstructed justice about something that was not considered to be a crime. So this is really, I think, degenerated into partisan politics. And the best thing we could do at this point is say, let's get on with the country's business. Are there some underlying constitutional issues? Yes, we should be addressing.
Well, as you know, there's no requirement that there being an underlying crime for obstruction of justice to exist. And you've got something like 800 former federal prosecutors who say they believe that the president would be prosecuted if indeed he weren't president right now. So you're not concerned about that at all?
I think most Americans would disagree with that. I think most Americans would disagree with that. Most Americans would hate the idea that you're called in to talk to the FBI, and when you're called in, they say, what did you say on the phone to somebody 2 months ago? And if you describe that inaccurately, then the government's going to say, we're going to put you in jail even though there was no crime committed. No, people are horrified by the idea that you could put someone in jail for obstructing justice on something where you didn't commit the crime.
So I think Rand Paul makes two major mistakes here in this analysis of his. Number one, he's assuming that Donald Trump is like any other American who's called into the FBI. But the reality of the obstruction of justice, as documented by all the cases in the Mueller report, show that Donald Trump repeatedly abused his power and his power as president, as the head of our government, to obstruct justice, to obstruct this investigation from being conducted and important information coming out about Russia's role meddling in the United States election, a role that was largely towards the goal of getting Donald Trump himself elected. And then the other issue with what Rand Paul said is that he's not addressing the reality of what obstruction of justice is. He's basically arguing against the way the law exists right now, and that's fine if he wants to put a piece of legislation forwards saying that's not right, but the reality is what President Trump did in obstructing justice, as these 800 former federal prosecutors say, would have led to an indictment if he were not president. That's the facts, full stop. And so Rand trying to argue away the law and saying, I just don't agree with it, that's irrelevant. What's relevant is the president obstructed justice. What are you going to do about it?
Rand Paul is definitely indicative of the Republican Party. Senators like him, Senators like Lindsey Graham are willing to defend this president and willing to do so, even if it's in stark contrast to things that they've said before or even voted before. That's totally fine with them.
Naomi, let's get to a highlight this week.
Yeah, so we have one highlight, and it's from an interview on This Week. This Week was hosted by George Stephanopoulos, but there was an interview by Jonathan Karl with Cory Booker. Cory Booker is a senator from the state of New Jersey, and he is running for the Democratic ticket for 2020. And there was this really interesting moment where Jonathan Karl asks Booker about an important issue for him, gun policy, gun control, gun violence, and Booker does not allow Karl to frame the conversation in the way that he wants to. It's really fascinating. Let's take a listen.
So you just outlined a 14-point gun plan on guns that has been called the most ambitious effort to deal with the gun issue of any of the Democratic candidates. How are you going to get this done?
Well, the first way you get this done is stop having a debate on the corporate gun lobby's terms. They've been forming this debate and telling us what we can't do. American history is a testimony to doing things people said was impossible.
But look at how Obama, after Newtown, he went to try to just get tougher background checks, which is just a fraction of what.
But you sound like what I encountered when I first took over City Hall as chief executive.
I know, but are you saying Obama didn't try hard enough? I mean, you're looking at a Senate that's going to be every bit as tough as the Senate that Barack Obama faced.
Well, again, when I became mayor of the city of Newark, one of the things I used to not tolerate was people telling me, hey, we tried this before, we couldn't get it done. To me,
I'm just asking how you're going to do it.
I'm telling you right now that what you're saying is that, hey, we have carnage in this country, like it's a uniquely American problem, and we can't solve it. I don't accept that at all. When Connecticut did licensing, their shootings dropped, their murders dropped 40%, suicides dropped 15%. These are things that have been tried and done and that work.
So one of the things that drove me crazy about this question from Jonathan Karl is I actually read this week Cory Booker's 14-point plan on gun policy. And it is, I think, the most ambitious of any of the Democratic candidates to deal with this problem. And there's tons of interesting points and ideas and strategies for the U.S. to adopt to reduce gun violence. But guess what? Jonathan Karl seemed to have zero interest in informing the public about any of those policies. His only question was, how are you going to get this done? But the audience doesn't even know what this is that's going to be gotten done. Like, it's ridiculous. And I feel like there's a lot of questions like this of these presidential candidates without recognizing that the audience who's watching this, the potential voter sitting at home, they want to know what these candidates stand for, what they're proposing, and then how they're going to get it done. But you got to start with knowing what they stand for. And I think papering over that and jumping straight to the how are you going to get it done is a complete disservice to the whole purpose of this type of journalism.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. The one caveat I would add to this is that this was a pre-taped interview, so we're not really sure how it was edited down. It's possible that they covered it in the full interview and they just didn't include it in this segment on This Week. What stood out to me in Cory Booker's...
But then that's a problem of editing, right? Whoever edited it and put it together,
yeah, no, of course.
I'm
still saying it's still a flaw, but I don't know. It would be inaccurate to say that they didn't talk about it. We didn't see that conversation.
True.
But getting back to what Cory Booker did or what he said, the thing that I found most effective and actually pretty fascinating was that he kind of dispelled the notion of what Jonathan Karl was trying to say, that the Senate would never be able to do this. And it's interesting because part of me thinks the how is actually very important. I think it's really irresponsible to, have grandiose plans when there's zero political will to get it done and zero strategy to get it done. But I think what Cory Booker's, he's not quite so far in that field. He's saying there are things that we can get done. There are things that we're seeing at the state level that we can model. We have to kind of reject the notion that this is impossible. We have to kind of stop framing the conversation in terms of corporate lobbying by the NRA. Like, he's kind of changing the parameters or the framework in which to have this conversation. And he doesn't just kind of accept the notion that Jonathan Karl does, because Jonathan Karl's version is very cynical. There's nothing that can be done here. And Cory Booker just does not take the bite.
Absolutely. Well, that takes us to, and we will be talking more about these candidate interviews because I think it's so important. And I don't know, we see again and again where some of these shows and interviewers kind of fall down on the job. But let's start with a really important issue, and that is foreign policy, foreign diplomacy. And in particular, the escalation of the U.S. trade war with China.
So, Brendan, before we dive into the very important interview with Larry Kudlow on Fox News Sunday, why don't we take a quick step back and just give a little bit of context about this trade war that we are experiencing with China right now. How did we get here? Where did it start from?
Well, just to begin, the main piece of news and the reason we're talking about it this week is that on Friday, Donald Trump raised the tariffs, and we should say, tariffs are taxes.
On consumers.
On consumers. On goods that are coming from China. So China, we buy goods from China, they come in here, and those goods now are going to have an additional tax, a duty laid. And before that was a 10% tax that Trump had put on last year on about $200 billion of Chinese goods. And now, as of Friday, that goes from 10% to 25%. So literally a quarter of the price of that good is being tacked on in addition to the base price as a result of these tariffs.
Yeah, so that includes products like computers, toilet paper, televisions, Christmas tree lights. I mean, so much of things that we use every day.
And we all know we trade a lot with China, but I think it's important to kind of look at quite how big of an issue this is when you put tariffs on these goods, and the U.S.-China relationship, and even why this is happening. The reason these tariffs are on here is because the United States is frustrated with our trading relationship with China. The U.S. feels like China is trading unfairly, and that's hurting U.S. workers and U.S. consumers and the U.S. economy overall. Now, U.S.-China trade didn't used to be as big as it is today. Back in 1979, right before China started its kind of economic reforms, trade between the U.S. and China was about $2 billion a year. In 2017, it was $636 billion a year. The U.S.'s largest merchandise trading partner is now China. It's also its third largest export market, who we sell goods to, and it's our biggest source of imports.
So we trade with China, we buy a lot of their products, and they buy a lot of ours.
Yeah, and these products that they buy of ours, China is actually the second biggest buyer of agriculture products from the United States. In fact, 63% of that is soybeans, and that's why a lot of soybean farmers are being really, really hard hit by these tariffs, because China is retaliating with the tariffs by adding tariffs to the things we sell to them.
So that makes total sense. So we don't like what their policies are. We put a bunch of tariffs on it, and they say we're going to do the same thing back, put a bunch of tariffs on soybeans, on pork, on various agricultural products, really slamming Midwest farmers, right?
Absolutely. And these farmers are already hurting for some other interesting reasons. So one of the main reasons why China buys so many soybeans is that they have a huge market for pork and pigs. They actually have the most number of pigs in the entire world, and they feed these pigs soybeans. But there's a problem going on with the pigs in China. They're actually getting this swine flu thing. A lot of the pigs are dying, and so they don't need to buy as many soybeans because their market is really hurt, and it's going to take a few years for it to recover. So already the soybean market was hurting in the United States because China wasn't buying as much. And now they're buying less and less because they're retaliating against the United States. But it's not just soybeans. In fact, think of General Motors. They make, tons of cars. They're a US-based company. Well, they actually have sold more cars and trucks in China than the United States every single year from 2010 to 2017. So it's soybeans, it's cars, and it's also planes. Boeing Corporation in 2017 delivered 202 planes to China. That's 26% of its total global deliveries, and it's the largest market that Boeing has outside of the United States.
And if China wanted to, they could buy planes from Europe, but they're not. They're buying American planes.
Absolutely. And China is a potentially, not only is it a huge market for the U.S., it's potentially going to become an even bigger market for the U.S. in the future. And that's what this is over. This trade dispute, it's not just over things as they are, but things as they're going to be in the years ahead. China right now has the largest population of middle-class citizens in the entire world. The middle class in China, which is thought of as people who make between $50,000 and $500,000 a year in this study, is about 109 million adults, whereas the US level is just 90 million adults. China's economy is growing, and its consumption, the amount of stuff that people buy in China, is growing at an annual rate of about 9%. In the US, that's just 1.5%. So it's a massive market for US goods.
So our economy is greatly impacted by our ability to sell to China and China selling to us. I mean, it's a global economy. These things don't happen in silos, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But the U.S. is frustrated by China. And here are some of the things that the U.S. Trade Representative says are the main things at issue. Number one, there's the fact that China is actually hacking into U.S. companies and creating what's called cyber economic espionage. And this is imagine they hack into the computers at Apple, find out what Apple's next iPhone is going to be, and then copy it and make it for themselves. That's the kind of stuff that they're kind of afraid of and that they think is happening.
And this happens for kind of transparency through different ways, right? So sometimes it's through employees, sometimes it's through private funding, sometimes there's kind of silent ownership. There's all these different ways where Chinese companies are able to access intellectual property by American companies, and those Chinese companies can or may be owned by the government. So essentially, the government is hacking and trying to get that information, possibly.
Absolutely. And world trade is often regulated by the World Trade Organization. And, number two is that China doesn't always follow through with its obligations according to the World Trade Organization. Number three, as you mentioned, Naomi, the Chinese government has its hands in a lot of industries in China, and it provides companies with subsidies and trade and investment barriers to promote and protect industries that are favored by the government, and to protect them in all sorts of ways. To make, for example, let's say, here's a good example. Let's say China's buying a bunch of planes from Boeing, and then it says, you know what? We've got our own plane manufacturer in China. Let's give them a ton of money and put a bunch of barriers to Boeing so that we can get people to buy more Chinese planes and not US planes. So that's another frustration because it's not, free trade. And number four, there's a concern that China is messing with the value of its currency in order to benefit itself over other countries like the US.
Yeah, and, we recognize this is super wonky and very complicated. Okay, so imagine there's like a community bake sale, right? And I have an incredible chocolate chip cookie recipe, and my neighbor buys a ton of my chocolate chip cookies, right? But I find out that she, for instance, is sending like her son over to my house to try to get my recipe, or that she is kind of changing the days of the sale, the community sales, or the days we're allowed to sell it because she wants to be able to get better deals for herself, right? Kind of all these sly different ways that she's trying to get the recipe for herself and get better prices. That's essentially what China is doing here. And so what's happening, this trade war is not just, we should be fully transparent. It didn't just start during the Trump administration. This has been going on for a long time, over Obama's presidency, probably, definitely during George W. Bush. And the strategy to address this is what's precarious right now, because Trump is just kind of full on, we're just going to start a trade war.
Yeah, and so we have these tariffs on here, and there's a potential for costs to go up for U.S. consumers. There are some studies out there saying that the cost of the tariffs that are existing already, and this was cited on Fox News Sunday, the cost to consumers is in the hundreds of dollars per household every year. And with these new tariffs, the average American household could end up paying more than $2,000 for their goods this year than last year as a result of these new tariffs. So it's a real issue, and it could really hurt the U.S. economy.
So definitely some dense material, and we wanted to spend that time kind of describing the trade war because we found that very few shows are actually spending that time to do that. We've seen it kind of that one time on Meet the Press. There was a helpful explanation by Chuck Todd and kind of one of the data downloads. But in general, the shows have not been very good about giving that context about this trade war.
And that takes us to today's interview on Fox News Sunday. Fox News Sunday was the only show of those that we looked at this week that had a White House representative on to talk about this important topic for the U.S. economy. I mean, think about it. I think it was just last week we were talking about how strong the economy was with those recent job numbers and economic numbers, and yet here we are with the potential for the Trump administration to tank that. So who did we hear from? We heard from Larry Kudlow. He's the director of the National Economic Council. He used to have a show on cable news himself, but here he was being interviewed by Chris Wallace.
So he has a lot to defend or explain about this kind of escalation in the trade war. How did you think he did, Brendan?
Well, I think it was a mixed bag, but I do think there was one particular message that he was able to put forwards that I thought was effective. Let's take a listen to that and then we'll get into kind of the other issues.
For many years, China trade was unfair, non-reciprocal, unbalanced, in many cases unlawful. And so we have to correct those. And one of the sticking points right now is we would like to see these corrections in an agreement which is codified by law in China, not just a state council announcement. We need to see something much clearer. And until we do, we have to keep our tariffs on. That's part of the enforcement process as far as we're concerned. And as the president has said, things that seem to be taking too long, and we can't accept any backtracking. We are representing the United States, the economy, farmers, auto workers, manufacturers. These are crucial parts to this discussion. So we want to be as sure as we can be. We don't think the Chinese have come far enough. We'll wait and see. The talks will continue.
So there was a lot there, but I felt like the strongest message he could have put forwards, and maybe he could have hit it even a little harder, was saying, we're representing the United States, the economy, the farmers, the auto workers, the manufacturers. We're there for them. I think that is a strong message, and I think it's an important message for the White House to keep pushing forwards, because a lot of the farmers and folks who are the hardest hit by these tariffs are Trump voters. And so it's important for the Trump administration, as they're putting this on, to say, we are doing this for you. And I thought that was a really good talking point from Larry Kudlow at the start of this interview.
Well, it's centering the fight on Americans, right? And Trump isn't very good about reminding America that he works for them. And so bringing this back to the American people deserve this, it's something to be said of whether or not that's actually going to help American farmers, but it's smart to bring it back to them, for sure.
But just because the White House is maybe fighting for these individuals, it's not always clear that the White House, and in particular the president, understands the rules of the game.
Or math.
One of the rules of those games is that tariffs, at their most basic level, are taxes that the American people pay, not China. Trump doesn't seem to get that still, over a year into this fight. And Chris Wallace pushed back on this very hard.
Let's talk about who pays for the higher tariffs on Chinese imports. Here's what President Trump had to say this week.
Our country can take in $120 billion a year in tariffs, paid for mostly by China, by the way, not by us. A lot of people try and steer it in a different direction. It's really ultimately it's paid for largely by China.
But Larry, that isn't true. It's not China that pays tariffs. It's the American importers, the American companies that pay what in effect is a tax increase and oftentimes passes it on to U.S. consumers.
Fair enough. In fact, both sides will pay. Both sides will pay in these things. And, of course, it depends.
If it's a tariff on goods coming into the country, the Chinese aren't paying.
No, but the Chinese will suffer GDP losses and so forth with respect to a diminishing export market and goods that they may need for their own
I understand that, but the president says it pays the tariffs. They may suffer consequences, but it's U.S. businesses and U.S. consumers who pay, correct?
Yes, to some extent. I don't disagree with that. Again, both sides will suffer on this.
So this actually made lots of news today. If you look at the New York Times front page, this was one of the top stories that one of Trump's advisors actually disagreed with him because Trump over and over and over again says that China, for the most part, pays these tariffs, and that's just not the case. And the fact that one of his top economic advisors acknowledges that this is also going to be felt by American consumers was news. So I think it's kind of pretty effective by Chris Wallace to push back on this, and he used a clip himself. He also used later, kind of the follow-up, some independent research and studies that demonstrate that this is the case. And so there's just no way, it seems, for Larry Kudlow to kind of not acknowledge it almost.
And yet Kudlow is still trying to hedge. He's still trying to say, well, both sides suffer from this. And that's not true that they pay that way, but maybe they pay the price in another way, blah, blah, blah. I feel like it's Mexico's going to pay for the wall all over again, where it's just like, no, the facts of the matter are Mexico is not going to pay for the wall. China is not paying for these tariffs. The U.S. pays for the wall. The U.S. pays for the tariffs. Trump is racking up a pretty big price tag, and yet he still keeps putting out these mistruths. And it's not surprising that Trump himself, we learned in the last week or so, lost $1 billion, the biggest tax loss in the early 1990s in all of America because he doesn't have a basic understanding of what it means and who needs to pay what. And I do want to push back a little bit on what Larry Kudlow is saying here, that China is going to suffer from reduced exports. There was literally today released, and it was at the top of CNBC, a note that was published by Goldman Sachs that was indicating that based on their analysis going into the cost of goods, that the cost of Trump's tariffs, and this is actually the headline. The headline goes, "The cost of Trump's tariffs has fallen entirely on U.S. businesses and households." What they found is that sometimes, let's say you're a Chinese company. Let's say you're a Chinese company that makes candles, and you sell these candles for $4. And now there's going to be a 25% tariff when you sell it to U.S. consumers. So rather than the consumer paying $4 for it now they're going to have to pay $5 for this candle. It might be assumed by the U.S. government that if they put on that extra dollar tariff, you might reduce your price so that you're competitive with all the other candles that are being sold in the U.S. market, maybe ones made by the U.S. companies. But no, what they found is that Chinese company, they're not discounting their candle so that the price is the same for the American consumer. They are charging the same amount. And here's what else this study found. U.S. companies are taking advantage of the higher prices. They're hiking the prices on their goods as well. So rather than U.S. companies and everyone selling candles for $4, because the Chinese candle is now $5, U.S. companies are selling theirs for $5 too. And who pays more? The U.S. consumer.
So there's just one more point in this Kudlow interview that I thought was really effective, and that's this kind of quick lightning round that Chris Wallace does in the interview. And I thought it was an effective way to kind of get through several topics or several points of clarification. Let's take a listen to how he does it.
All right, I want to go through a quick checklist, and I want you quick answers here, like a lightning round on where we stand right now. Do you expect China to retaliate for our increase in tariffs, and how soon?
I think I do. But it's interesting, the expected countermeasures have not yet materialized. We may know more today or even this evening or tomorrow. I reckon they will. We'll see what they come up with. So far, we haven't heard on that basis.
Are new talks, at this point, there was talk, talks will continue. Are new talks scheduled with China?
Not yet. But the Chinese have invited Ambassador Lighthizer to come over to Beijing, Private Secretary Mnuchin also. No concrete, definite plans yet. I do expect that. And by the by, let me repeat, the strong possibility that the two presidents will meet in Japan at the G20 meeting.
How long before President Trump makes good on his threat to impose 25% tariffs on all the rest of Chinese imports into this country, basically that final $300 billion in Chinese goods?
Well, we've already launched that process up on the USTR website. What happens in this, if I get this right, we will have announcements, we will have hearings, we will have public comments.
Okay, so I think this is really important to note. We haven't seen this very often in the other Sunday shows. I was trying to think back if Jake Tapper had ever done this before, and I couldn't think if he had, or at least not in recent memory. And I think what it demonstrates here is that Chris Wallace's team and Chris Wallace, they tend to really prepare for their kind of signature interviews. There's a lot of details that Chris Wallace is looking to get from it. And I think for the most part, Larry Kudlow knows most of the details. I would be shocked if there was this level of specificity, let's say, with an interview, I don't know, with Ben Carson or, somebody from Health and Human Services and talking about kind of the impacts of some of the abortion regulation or changes in the Affordable Care Act. I mean, Chris Wallace is really looking for very recent changes to decisions and negotiations. And I think we should encourage the shows to do this more. Like, they went through a lot of different points really quickly.
Yeah, I think I've seen that done by Margaret Brennan when it comes to foreign policy interviews, where she'll kind of go through a quick list. And we had, if I remember correctly, previously dinged her on this because she'd go through these things so quickly without a lot of context for the listener or the viewer And that could be very confusing.
But I think what's different here is these are kind of sub-points within the same topic, right? It's still the trade war, and she'd be like Iran, North Korea. She'd kind of jump, maybe still foreign affairs, but from very different parts of the region of the globe. Okay, so we've been kind of super laser focused on this trade war with China, but I think if we take a step back, this is kind of in line with how Trump negotiates with countries around the world. And we see this because there's kind of moments of potential escalation in Venezuela, in North Korea, and Iran.
Yeah, it's really, really concerning. And these things are not in isolation, as Juan Williams reminded us. He's a journalist and Fox News analyst, and he was on Fox News Sunday.
And China, remember, as we're talking about the China trade deal, plays a key role because they have the most at leverage over North Korea, and at the moment they're not exactly open to helping us.
And what we see here, and it was mentioned on the panel on This Week specifically, is that because there's so much potential volatile moments around the globe, it so easily could kind of fall apart or become quite precarious. And if you look at, for example, North Korea, China is a huge player in the region. And so if we have a huge giant trade war with China, it's going to be a problem if North Korea has nuclear bombs and the global superpower in the region doesn't want to deal with it.
And so many of these issues, Larry Kudlow's on there talking about this, complicated process, but a lot of it is driven by Trump's gut and his instincts and his tweets. And that's not always the most successful thing in the world, as Rahm Emanuel reminded us on This Week in conversation with George Stephanopoulos and Chris Christie.
A year ago, the president does seem reluctant to getting pushed into a confrontation in Venezuela. It does seem reluctant, clearly with North Korea, less so with Iran.
This is his personality. I mean, listen.
Yeah, but we need a foreign policy, not a personality.
I understand that, but I'm trying to explain this to you, Ron, so hang in there, okay?
Yeah. Well, I'm impatient, so hurry up.
I understand. This is his personality. He is not a confrontational person, despite what you see on Twitter, despite all those other things that you see. He is not a confrontational person in that type of way. So these situations are difficult for him.
And what has his personality gotten us? Well, as was reminded in an article in Politico this week that said Trump's trade policy is imploding, it had a really important line that said, quote, "So far, Trump has only one trade agreement to his name after 2 years in office, a relatively minor agreement with South Korea that didn't require approval from Congress." And yet he's imposed all these tariffs. He's tried to, renegotiate NAFTA. And to what effect? I mean, there's been no success so far.
Yeah, so lots of moving pieces. It's kind of scary that we just got a Secretary of Defense and that there seems to be some disagreement with people in the administration about the appropriate or worthwhile ways to move forward in, like we said, North Korea, China, Venezuela, Iran. But we're going to have to keep a close eye on it and then also be very mindful of how the media is covering those stories.
And speaking of being mindful of coverage, just want to do a quick fact check on myself there. The exact headline of that article I cited in Politico is Trump's trade agenda on the verge of imploding, not is imploding, although that was on the 10th and today is the 12th. And the article is by Doug Palmer in Politico.
Okay, so that takes us to segment 2, and that's about Kamala Harris, one of our senators.
Kamala Harris, and also the way that these Sunday morning shows are conducting these interviews. And right off the bat, I want to talk about how Jake Tapper asked probably the first third of his questions in this really in-depth profile. This is another one of those instances of Jake Tapper going into the field. We saw it last week when he went to Cory Booker's apartment. And this week we're seeing it with him going down to Oakland to visit Kamala Harris, where she lives, and to kind of pick her brain. But the first third of questions I feel like that were asked just like this one that you'll hear right now on the topic of trade.
Trade has been drawing some dividing lines in the Democratic field. When it comes to NAFTA, for example, Bernie Sanders, one of your opponents, attacked Joe Biden, another one of your opponents last week, saying, quote, "I helped lead the fight against NAFTA. Biden voted for NAFTA." Who was right on NAFTA, Biden or Sanders?
Well, I'm not going to choose between the two of them, but I'll tell you.
Would you have voted for NAFTA?
I would not have voted for NAFTA, and because I believe that we can do a better job to protect American workers.
So what did we hear from Jake Tapper there? He tried to have Kamala Harris choose if she agreed with some of her political opponents. That's how he framed the question about a really important issue. And it wasn't the first time. Before that, he talked about these tariffs that Trump was imposing on Chinese exports. And he asked her, do you agree with Leader Schumer that President Trump's doing the right thing when it comes to the Chinese? That was Tapper's question. And it's like, what an ineffective way to ask people about important issues by simply saying, do you agree with this person? Do you agree with that person? Do you agree with this statement? Do you agree with that statement? It doesn't get to the heart of the issue. It could be just a yes or no. And it's often in the form of a gotcha where you're asking them to agree with political opponents.
But it also requires less work in terms of preparation.
Yeah. Yeah, just taking whatever was said recently in the news and saying, hey, do you agree with this?
Let's have a conversation about
this.
this.
Do you agree with this? What do you think of that? Later on in the interview, he asked Kamala Harris directly about her record, about her past, and these were much deeper and more meaningful questions.
Yeah, I actually really appreciated those questions. I think we don't see a lot of Kamala Harris as the person, as the woman, as kind of what shaped her leadership style as much. And those questions were really, really fruitful for me.
And that's not to say he can't ask her about issues in the news, but say, what would you do if you were president to deal with U.S.-China relations and
frame
trade?
it in the context of the candidate you're talking to.
Exactly.
But we do have to acknowledge that her interview had some real fumbles, and it seemed surprising to us, at least in watching this show, that Kamala Harris, just for too many instances, cannot give a straight answer. And sometimes when she does give her answer, it takes her a long time to find her stride. In this example in the interview, Jake Tapper brings up her support of Medicare for All.
And in particular, how she answered a question in a CNN town hall that Jake Tapper moderated about a month ago.
Well, you support the Bernie Sanders bill, which essentially gets rid of insurance.
I support Medicare for All, but I really do need to clear up what happened on that stage.
Okay.
It was in the context of saying, let's get rid of all the bureaucracy. Let's get all of the ways.
Oh, not the insurance companies.
No, that's not what I meant. I know it was interpreted that way. If you watch the tape, I think you'll see that there are obviously many interpretations of what I said. What I meant is let's get rid of the bureaucracy. As it relates
to Medicare. But the bill
gets
rid of insurance.
But no. It does not get rid of insurance. It does not get rid of insurance. And listen, and let me just tell you where I am. Let's tell you where I am.
So that was a really long time to get to where she stands on a really important topic. In fact, what Americans say is like their number one topic in this election, which is healthcare. And we get that terrible clip of her saying, quote,
if you watch the tape, I think you'll see that there are obviously many interpretations of what I said.
You couldn't have a more politician-y statement than that.
Yeah, that's no bueno. Not at all. But there was one moment in the interview where we kind of disagreed or had an interesting brief conversation about it that we wanted to discuss on the show about vision versus strategy. And in this moment, Jake Tapper is asking Kamala Harris about Cory Booker's 14-point gun proposal and whether or not she would move forward with something similar.
Which, by the way, just as an aside, the viewer learns more about Cory Booker's gun proposal in Jake Tapper's question here than in the entire interview with Cory Booker that was conducted on This Week. Just FYI.
Cory Booker has called for creating federal gun licenses, which would require fingerprints, an interview, and a gun safety course. Opponents of this say it would essentially create a way for the government to track gun owners. Would you support a federal gun license?
I like the idea, but, Jake, I'm going to tell you on this issue of the need for gun safety laws, we're not at any loss for good ideas. People have been having good ideas for decades on this issue. What we're at a loss is for people in Congress to have the courage to do something. I'm going to tell you on this subject, we're not waiting for the worst tragedy, because we've seen the worst of tragedies, including what just happened this week, and seeing the heroism of a child who we now mourn his loss, his parents' only child. We're not waiting for tragedies, and we are not waiting for good ideas. Universal background checks? Check. really good idea. You might want to know if someone has been proven to be a danger to themselves or others before they can buy a lethal weapon. What we're waiting for is Congress to have the courage to act. And so let me tell you what I'm proposing. I'm proposing, one, that if by my 100th day in office, when elected President of the United States, the United States Congress fails to put a bill on my desk to sign with all of the good ideas or any of the good ideas, then I am prepared to take executive action because that's what's needed.
Executive
action.
So here's Jake Tapper asking Kamala Harris about a particular policy or proposal and if she supports the idea. Not that if she agrees with a certain thing Cory Booker said, but whether she thinks a proposal, an actual policy, is a good idea or not. I think she does a great job here of expanding to answer guns from her perspective and the gun issue from her perspective. Although I do take issue a little bit with the fact that her take on this is not, here's my plan to solve gun violence. It's, here's what I'm going to do to get it done, because getting things done is more important to talk about than the particular plans. And this is something that a few of I think it's an interesting division in the 2020 Democratic race, where you have some candidates such as Elizabeth Warren or Cory Booker or even Bernie Sanders who have put forward particular policy ideas. And then you have candidates like Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg who literally don't have a policy section on their website right now. And I think that's a fascinating division. And I definitely lean more towards people who've done the homework to try to come up with some interesting ideas. But I think, Naomi, you have a different perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, I found it really interesting, the fact that she called out that we have plenty of good ideas. We just need action by Congress. And I don't think this is true of every issue. But as I mentioned earlier, I do think it's important that we acknowledge the political climate that we're in for certain issues and what it would take to actually do something. In this example, gun violence, Kamala Harris is saying we have plenty of ideas, we actually just need to move on it. And I found that bluntness actually really refreshing, and I appreciated that she felt like she didn't have to come up with some giant new thing. Not to say that Cory Booker, shouldn't have done that, but I just found it really refreshing that she was just like, no, it's a priority for me to do something and actually move forward with it. And bringing it back to the realities of the political climate, I think when we don't acknowledge it, when our policies are purely aspirational, and again, there is value in that, but when they're purely aspirational, then you have all this kind of backtracking for people who have supported it or said good things about it. And I think we see that directly with Medicare for All, where, as we talked about just in that last clip, she says she supports Medicare for All. She was a co-sponsor on Bernie Sanders' plan. But now it sounds like what she really wants is a public option. And it might have been more appropriate for her and lots of other people who signed on for Medicare for All to just been more aggressive for a public option, because now you don't have these super awkward backtracking of trying to defend them supporting Medicare for All, but then being a pragmatic realist and saying, private health insurance is here to stay. And so I think the how is really important for consumers, for citizens, for everyone to acknowledge. And if you are an elected leader, I think there's a level of responsibility to hold those things in your mind when kind of talking about the future.
Yeah, I do think it's an interesting spin on the issue for her on this topic. I guess my one criticism I would have for her answer is, well, I guess maybe two criticisms. Number one, she doesn't say exactly how she's going to get Congress to have the courage to do something.
Yeah, that's fair.
And so it's like, do you want somebody who has great ideas but doesn't have a real plan for passing it in Congress, or somebody who doesn't have great ideas and also doesn't have a plan for passing it in Congress? Like, which one's better? And then the other issue is her saying, I'm going to take executive action anyway, even if Congress does nothing, might be a way to telegraph to Congress that, hey, it's not really important for you to do this because I'm going to do something anyway. It kind of takes the pressure off them a little bit to say she's going to do it by executive action. But these are all talking points. This is all, as they would say in the tech industry, vaporware. when a tech company comes out and says, look at all this great new software that can do this and that and this and that. Oh, but by the way, reporters, you can't touch it and it's not going to be released until TBD. So, and everyone's like, so it doesn't exist?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So overall, Naomi, what was your take on this interview with Kamala Harris?
Overall, I was glad that State of the Union kind of spent the time that they did on this interview with Kamala Harris. I think I learned a lot about her. Well, I feel like I knew most of this, but I think as a national candidate, it was one of the first times I saw her kind of giving that fuller picture of herself again, of her background, of her leadership style. She did have that really good example, which we didn't have time to talk about today, about her truancy policy and kind of why it was designed the way it was and changes she would make in the future, but that there was value in it. I think it painted a fuller picture of Kamala Harris, the candidate.
Yeah, and I do like that State of the Union is taking the time, and literally Jake Tapper is flying across the country to do these segments. I think that's a positive thing. As an actual viewer, I think I appreciate it. And I hope that more of the Sunday shows make an effort to try to get all the candidates on, not just once, but multiple times throughout the primary. But that takes us to show rankings this week, Naomi. Where would you put the number one show? It's a lot easier this week. We only have 3 shows to talk about.
I think Fox News Sunday.
Yeah, I agree. I think Fox News Sunday for sure. We didn't get to talk too much about the panel, but there was a really, really substantive panel on Fox News Sunday this week.
Which is wild because last week we thought it was a joke. But clearly Chris Wallace is able to book solid people and have a rich conversation.
And of course, with the Kudlow interview was really good. And as much as we enjoyed the interview with Kamala Harris on State of the Union, there wasn't a lot more that happened on that show. It kind of sat out the typical Sunday and spent all this time. And sometimes that's what should be done. But when you look at kind of the story of the week and kind of giving people that, I think I would give it to this episode. We had a broader range of guests, and the panel was really, really fascinating. I think particularly for people like you and me, Naomi, where you had Christie, former governor of New Jersey, Rahm Emanuel, former White House chief of staff and mayor of Chicago, along with Maggie Haberman. It was really something of a powerhouse roundtable, truly, as they call it on This Week. And Seungmin Kim, yeah.
Yeah, I think my issue with State of the Union is that I feel like the shows this week, it was a week to inform and educate the listeners. And I think in general, that's State of the Union's weakest capability. And so it doesn't really stand out. This is a week to kind of inform viewers on the trade war with China, or possibly to inform viewers that Iran is ramping up production of their nuclear capabilities, or 3, just anything that happened in Venezuela. This is just a week to inform on kind of dense topics, and State of the Union literally did not even touch them. And so I just thought they really kind of took a hands-off approach.
But not to say we don't like them going off and doing these in-depth
interviews.
But there's a way to do both.
Other than Kamala Harris, I don't know anything else that I found valuable on State of the Union.
I think there was a moment or two in the panel, but I understand what you're saying. So, number 1, Fox News Sunday. Number 2, This Week. Number 3, State of the Union. And just to leave you with something a little fun, with a little bit of levity, take a listen to this clip of Larry Kudlow and let me know if anything stands out to you in it. This is from Fox News Sunday.
Negotiations, over time, stop, go. The speed may be fast or the speed may be slow.
Stop, go. The speed may be fast, the speed may be slow. Just a little bit of poetry there from Larry Kudlow to close out the show. So that's it for Polylog this week and every week. We encourage you to make your dialogue count. And this week we would challenge you to live your week with a little bit of rhyme.
All right, we have a poetry challenge for the week.
Poetry
a polylog first. Do you have any haikus or other verses you'd like to share with us?
Sonnets?
Why do you got to make it so much harder? I offer haikus. You demand sonnets. If you would like to email any of those, you can email us at podcast@polylog.com. You can tweet at me at @SotoNaomi_.
You can tweet at me in iambic pentameter at @bstidle. Or you can follow the show at PolylogCast.
And if you would like to support the show or you find value in it, we would love your support at patreon.com/polylog.
Thanks, everyone, and we will talk to you next week.
Bye.
Bye.